It's the week ending Saturday the 22nd of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Conservative MPs selecting their final two contenders for the role of Prime Minister, the US blaming Iran for oil tanker and drone sabotage, raising the tension between the two nations, and Facebook announcing plans to launch its own digital currency. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Kari Wilkin and Rebecca Gillie, and from our sister site across the pond, theweek.com, Jessica Hullinger. And starting the show this week is Jess. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we realized just how deep-seated sexism is in American politics.
There are people who are ready for big structural change in this country. They're ready for change, and I got a plan for that.
Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren there, speaking at a recent event in Iowa. Jess, what's the story?
Yeah, so the story is that a survey is out this week that found that 20% of Democratic voters, as well as independent men, said that they think that women are less effective in politics than men. Right? So this is among Democratic voters, which is interesting because it sort of contradicts the perceived atmosphere among the Democratic Party right now. There are a lot of women running for president under the Democratic banner, more than ever before, and Elizabeth Warren is obviously one of them. She's seen a huge surge in popularity, but the question is, will the Democrats actually vote for a woman? And if not, why?
And Democrats themselves are then questioning that, are they? They're saying, on the one hand, I'm a Democrat, so my instinct might be to elect someone who isn't an old white man, but on the other hand, old white men seem to get elected, so I'm going to think about that because I want a Democratic president.
Right, that's right. It sort of comes down to this question of electability, which is a big buzzword in the news right now. And electability is sort of basically, is this person going to beat Donald Trump? And a lot of people in the Democratic Party worry that a woman might not be able to do that. But interestingly, when you ask people without asking about electability who they would vote for president, Elizabeth Warren comes out on top.
But this isn't just an American story, is it, Rebecca? We have similar patterns in this country as well of women feeling, of people either thinking that women aren't as electable or women themselves feeling alienated from politics.
Yeah, there was another statistic in that study which I thought was relevant to all countries, not just the US, where they found that about 3/4 of people said that they would be happy to vote for a female candidate, but only 33% thought that their neighbours would vote for a female candidate. So there is this perceived idea that, I'm progressive. Obviously, I would never be, prejudiced or narrow-minded, but I just don't think that everyone else is ready for it. Which obviously, on one hand, you could see the optimism of, well, maybe if people are just underestimating how progressive the people around them are, that female candidates or, people of colour could come out on top anyway. But also it does fuel this fear about electability. And if you're going around thinking, I want my party to win, then, yeah, you could end up going for a candidate that, is a bit more in the traditional mould.
But Kari, I guess if you're an American voter and you're considering the question of electability, then of course the only female who's ever stood is Hillary Clinton. That's a bad example. Whereas in the UK, we have had Margaret Thatcher, one of the most successful prime ministers of all time, in terms of election. And we've just had a female prime minister, albeit not a particularly popular one. So it shouldn't be the same here, should it?
Well, it shouldn't, but, only this week, Andrea Leadsom was reportedly told by senior Tory women that they wouldn't back her as because the party couldn't have, quote, another woman as Prime Minister after Theresa May. I mean, can you imagine if the roles were reversed and they were saying to a man, no, we can't have another man? It's ridiculous. So even this in Britain, which did have the first, one of the first female leaders in Europe, it's clearly, we've clearly got a long way to go. And it's almost a lack of confidence in ourselves. And I think, people say that women are less interested in politics. I think perhaps it's actually that women are less confident about being involved in and perceived to be interested in politics. And I do think that Hillary Clinton's defeat in 2016 created another major setback for women's hopes. So many women thought that she could break this cycle, but in the end, Trump managed to secure most of the male vote, and that proved enough.
But actually, this isn't a case of speculation. There is data on that as well, isn't there, Jess? There was a study in The Economist this week showing women actually are less interested in politics, statistically appear to be less interested, or answer the question anyway, saying that they are.
This was in The Economist, and it talked about the gender gap in politics. And it found that in Britain, the gender gap in interest in politics starts at a really young age. They looked at the age of 15, and it actually is about 20 percentage points, and it gets larger from there. So men are more interested in politics from a young age, and you have to wonder if that's because they see far more men in politics.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think, there's such a lack of role models in politics. Kids turn on the TV, well, I presume they are turning the TV to watch Parliament, and it's just row upon row of male faces. But again, I'm not sure that... I think it's slightly misleading perhaps to say interest in and more that feeling excluded from. And I think that's a key difference. And also... But
the survey did say interest in. That's what the question they were answering was.
A lot of this is self-reported. You ask someone, are you interested in? I would argue that perhaps women are less likely to say, yes, I am, because they feel that they're not as knowledgeable about politics, even though possibly they are.
And actually with the Brexit Party as well, another study, Rebecca, saying that women are less likely to vote for them.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing about this is that even though men and women voted for Brexit or against Brexit in similar numbers, women are much more likely to be in favour of a so-called soft Brexit. I mean, it's not surprising, as if you look at Nigel Farage, is very, pint of ale in one hand, leaning against the bar, blathering on, which I think, men are on the whole generally slightly more receptive to, or at least less repulsed by as an image than the average female voter. But looking at where we are now, the Conservatives kind of courting these Brexit Party voters, it's not necessarily a very good outcome for women. And a lot of those hard Brexit views are often correlated. The proponents of hard Brexit, they often have that kind of more of a libertarian philosophy. They want to tax people less, spend less money on public services. Well, these all go against the primary concerns of female voters, which tend to be things like the NHS, social care, childcare, etc., because the burden of those things does still fall proportionately on women.
And ironically, I think that's part of the reason women do tend to be less involved in politics. They're less likely to join political organisations, that sort of thing. Because they have less of these key resources, they don't have as much time and money and political networks as men. The gap's lessening, but it's still a way to go.
And it's a very difficult thing to try and bridge that gap as well, compared to some other forms of discrimination or sexism, because the number one thing which would improve the interest of young girls and then women in politics would be seeing more women involved in politics. But obviously it's a vicious circle, because those women aren't necessarily running for office in the same numbers as men.
So as you say, it's this male dominated culture in parties and parliaments where it's mostly men recruiting and championing candidates, and the system isn't set up for female politicians. Labour's Stella Creasy was speaking out this week because IPSA, the body which regulates MPs' pay, doesn't automatically provide paid cover for MPs on maternal leave. In any other industry that would be shocking, and yet our lawmakers do not provide automatic maternity care.
I mean, where do you put it, Jess, as someone who sort of studies American politics on a daily basis? Where do you think the chances are in terms of a female president having a hope, or even a presidential candidate at the next election?
I would love to be optimistic. I think that the enthusiasm around Warren's campaign is very encouraging, but the statistic that Rebecca cited earlier about people saying that their neighbors don't think that a woman could be president, that is very revealing about what people actually feel about themselves. They don't want to admit that that's how they feel, so they blame it on their neighbors. I think that the enthusiasm is sort of masking a very, like I said, deep-seated sexism, and I worry that we're not quite there yet. I would love for us to be there. It's disappointing as well, because studies have shown that women are much more effective in politics. They're better problem solvers. They're much more likely to compromise and negotiate. So they're much more effective when they're in power and when they're leading.
Why do you think that might be?
They've had to work harder to get there, haven't they? They've got to be better than the men to prove themselves. I think there's this staggering figure that since 2009, the average female legislator in Congress has had 2.31 on average of her bills enacted, compared with 1.57 for male legislators. I mean,
that's still not very many. I'm not saying anything about a gender point. 2 bills across 4 years.
Legislatures.
I would hope that a legislator would have like 10 bills. Is it really 1.53?
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
pathetic,
that in itself is not great, but the women are doing better. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Rebecca, you're up next after this. OK, Rebecca, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
There may be 1 million bicycles in Beijing, but there's a lot more in Delhi.
I think the challenge is how do you retain that dividend status of this demographic boom? The real challenge going forward is not how to contain population, but how do you nurture and exploit this population growth to your best economic advantages. We have a short window of opportunity in my view.
That was A.K. Batapchiraya, editorial director at Business Standard, talking on Indian public broadcaster Rajya Sabha TV about their rising population. Rebecca, give us some numbers.
This is a new UN study of projected global population, which has found that in 2027, so just 8 years away, India will overtake China as the most populous nation on Earth.
Wow.
That is a result of basically India's population is continuing to expand at a really staggering rate, and China's population is starting to shrink a bit. Beijing has kind of seen this coming. That's why that was kind of the motivation behind them ending the one-child policy a few years ago, but their population is still continuing to stagnate.
And why is India's booming?
India's has been booming for a really long time. It's, the country is still in the process of modernizing its economy, industrializing. Families are having more children. This is something that, you see through time and across the world. As countries become more industrialized and the population becomes wealthier or more educated, women end up having fewer children, which is happening in China at the moment and happening also across Europe and Australasia, etc.
Okay, and so what? I mean, why is this the story of the week? I mean, somewhere's got to have the most populous country.
Somewhere has got to have the most populous country. Just on a kind of what I thought was just an interesting kind of quixotic note is that how China has really come to represent in our imaginations this country of 1 billion people, and China is going to lead the world, China's going to take over the world, they've got so many people, but India is really going to step into that role really soon. The other thing that I found very interesting from the study was that they found that they expanded the projection to 2050, and in 2050, let's see if you can guess the third most populous country.
Love it. Let's play a game. Yeah.
They may already know.
We already know.
I already
so we
may have
can't
let
play.
slip this trivia.
Oh,
just you,
that's
Olly.
a crap game
After
then.
India and China in 2050, the third most populous country in the world will be?
Well, I mean, in terms of landmass, I'd assume somewhere like Russia, but go on.
Nigeria.
Wow.
Ahead of the US.
And so,
Why is that?
because their population's exploding too. The sub-Saharan African population is going to double by 2050. I think it's something that most of the world isn't really paying attention to.
It's this trend, isn't it? Fertility transition, as you were saying, whereas countries go richer, people have fewer children. So it is going to be sort of the poorer countries that are still have higher populations, whereas the richer developing world has fewer.
I've got one last really good one for
No,
you.
you can hold on to that
Okay,
fact.
well, I'll bring
I'm
it
going to
out.
bring Jess in,
All right.
and then we'll hold on to it. I'm going to tease
Hold on to it. Don't worry.
Jess.
So I think what I find interesting and also very concerning is what this means for India's population, and which is poor. Quite a lot of people in India are very, very poor. So how do you build an economy that can sustain more and more people? How do you educate them? How do you give them good health care? What does that look like? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's a huge question that they're going to have to ask themselves and answer.
And a smaller landmass than China as well. I mean, forgive me if that's an oversimplistic point, but I know that a lot more people emigrate from India, but might we see that number go up as well because there's going to be less space for people to live in?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, one trend that India and China have in common is the development of megacities. And I think that's probably going to become even more common in India now. If you look at China, you've got cities that, some of us have probably never even heard of, and there's, 10 or 15 million people living in them. India's kind of going in that direction. And I think that their urban centres are definitely going to expand and become far more dense.
And people of whatever level of income bracket require extra infrastructure, don't they? Is there evidence that that's being put in place?
I think the problem is, as Rebecca said, that it's mainly most of these population increases are happening in sub-Saharan Africa. They just don't have the economies to do this. At the same time, these population increases are putting more pressure on the environment, although they're putting a little bit more. They're certainly being blamed for it, whereas in fact, it is actually the industrialized world, the developed world, where the population rate is falling, but we actually tend to produce most of the pollution. So but it will be these overpopulated countries that are worst hit by that.
There is a kind of an upside to it as well. The Times of India struck kind of an ambivalent note in an editorial responding to this study, where they said that on one hand, the government has already failed to eradicate poverty in the way that it had planned, and that it's still struggling, and that there's going to be a big question over, how India is going to look in the future. But also, they're pointing out the youth boom. Their population is very young, and how this has enabled India to really, have this vibrant economy that's just growing and growing. And we're probably going to see something similar in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Young population, getting more educated by generations, and, eager to bring the country prosperity.
And that might mean something for British business as well at the moment, thinking post-Brexit, who are we going to be trading with? Maybe you should be focusing your sights on Nigeria.
And also it means something for us. We, as a country where the population is, where there are fewer births happening, our population is aging. So we, in turn, will get left behind. I think this UN projections say that at the moment, only 1 in 11 people worldwide are aged 65 or over, whereas that's meant to be 1 in 6 by 2050. But these countries that have a younger population are going to have a massive advantage.
I mean, Jess, when Rebecca says that this might challenge how we see China, it does a bit. But when people talk about the massive population in China, and maybe that is informed by the one-child policy and the legacy of that, it seems to me the thing that they're really remarking upon is the fact that it's so many people under one system of government. That's what's amazing about it, is that you have such a huge mass of people in such a large country with no political opposition, all, potentially being able to be signed up to the army and all the rest of it. So this doesn't really change the way we see China, does it?
I don't think so. No, I agree with you, actually. I don't think it'll change exactly how we see China. I think that the way we see China is pretty stuck in our heads.
I think another important fact is these are just projections, and the UN revises its population projections every 2 years. So they're just estimates. And even though the estimates might shift only slightly between each update, they have actually shifted quite significantly over time. And a lot of demographers estimate that while the world population will continue growing, it's actually going to peak around 2070 and then start falling again. So I think, obviously, there's a lot of fear about overpopulation, which ties into all this, but I don't think it's by any means decided how much we need to panic yet.
Okay, I guess it's the kind of thing you can pronounce upon now, and then you'll be dead by the time the answer comes through. So,
well, exactly. Can I get my fact out now?
Go on.
This is one you can play along with at home, actually. In 2050, more than half of the global population will be clustered in 9 countries. Just take a minute, think about what you might expect to see in there. Okay, the 9 countries are the USA, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Indonesia, and Egypt.
And not Russia.
Not a Russia in the bunch.
Yeah, it's not about landmass, is it? All right, one last story to come after this. And so finally this week, it's Kari. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think it's the week we ask, do we need to monitor our self-monitoring?
You always seem to have a new iteration. You've always come on with new iterations. Something in the works big?
Well, we always have something in the works, Jim. We have several upgrades of our G6 system coming out over the next year. The direct-to-watch version of the G6 will be out soon.
The direct-to
the Apple Watch.
Yep, that's what I've been waiting for.
It's coming.
It is coming. Okay, because remember Tim Cook said that his biggest contribution will be to healthcare.
Oh, yeah, and this tool is great for people with diabetes.
That was Dexcom's CEO, Kevin Sayer, being interviewed by Mad Money's Jim Cramer, who seemed very happy about all of this. But Kari, 2 questions. First of all, who are Dexcom? And secondly, what is quantified self-movement?
Well, so Dexcom manufacture wearable glucose system monitors.
Right.
And Apple for a long time had been trying to crack a way to build integrated glucose tracker into the Apple Watch. There's been reports of this for years, but this week, this guy has come out and said, okay, we've teamed up with them, we're really close, it's going to be integrated into the Apple Watch within the next year.
Okay, so that's the news story.
This is the news story.
And the buzz term, quantified self-movement, means what?
And this is all great news for the quantified self-movement, which was a term invented in about 12 years ago by 2 Wired editors who noticed this growing trend of self-tracking with tech, and it's now a global community. It's got its own website. They have conferences where they do show and tells. The motto is self-knowledge through self-tracking. There are all different branches looking into various ways. For example, the quantified baby, where it's concerned with collecting extensive data on a baby's daily activities and then uses this data to make inferences about behavior and health. So they're really sort of trying to nail and control their life through figures by quantifying the self.
To what extent do you think, Jess, Silicon Valley stepped in and created a problem where there wasn't one to flog us more gadgets?
Oh, that is absolutely the case, I think. I mean, Silicon Valley wants to know everything about you. They want all of your data. And I think that it's a little bit freaky that we are allowing them to monitor our health as well. And where is that data going? What's happening to it? There are a lot of questions to be raised about the big tech question.
Yeah, because often, Kari, these companies say, well, don't worry, we'll never share your data with anybody. And even if that's true, even if they don't get hacked, for example, they might ultimately get sold to Google or Microsoft or Facebook, and then they have sold your data to somebody. It might be the same company technically, but it's a different person running it.
And it's this deeply personal data. You know, Apple recently, they've also just launched My Skin Track UV, which is the first wearable sun safety sensor, which measures your exposure to UV pollution and pollen. Another recent launch, which is more personal, they're going to include in the Apple Watch a menstrual cycle tracking feature. You know, I don't really want Facebook to have that kind of information. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure Apple would argue, were they here, and the invitation remains open to Tim Cook, that they would have no intention of sharing that with Facebook unless you chose to. Why do you think people are so hooked on tracking these things, though? Because there is consumer demand, even if it is being flogged to them and they didn't want it in the first place.
I think for some people it helps to cope with life's uncertainties. You know, we don't have religion to turn to anymore, so we want answers in, you know, and it adds structure and meaning, if you like, and you can find value and support in sharing data with other people. I think what's really worrying is that people think by having this data that they're informed, whereas in fact, this is the data you might give to a doctor or whatever, but most of these people aren't actually qualified to draw these inferences.
And that support that Kari references, Rebecca, that's in the DNA of a lot of this stuff, isn't it? It's not just that you want information on how much you've slept last night. It's that, bizarrely, you might then share it with your friends to compare notes.
We're a thirsty species, aren't we? We're obsessed. You know, who doesn't? We're all addicted. We all want to know more information about ourselves. You know, personality testing, when people tell you that they're an extroverted introvert or what have you, you know, we always want to know more about ourselves. And this isn't like, they're so devious and clever in Silicon Valley, because this is exactly the kind of thing that we want. I remember when my friend, when she was diagnosed with diabetes, when we were like, I think about 11 or 12, she had to bring her, blood sugar tracker to school. And people would literally queue up being like, okay, do me. Because everybody wanted to know what their blood sugar was for no particular reason, but just because we have this innate craving to know more about ourselves. And they have really come up with a great way to monetize all these different aspects that you can then obsessively look at. You know, it started with things like step trackers, which are nice and lots of people use them. But then when it's built into your whole system, I was away with some friends recently and one of them's watch kept going off because it noticed she hadn't done any physical movement in like 30 minutes. You know, you can really base your whole life around these.
It can create a sort of anxiety in a lot of people. There was one study that showed that fertility tracking apps, which are really popular right now, can actually make people feel, women in particular, obviously, feel really burdened and obsessed and trapped. And it can be quite bad for your health.
And also it sets these sort of actually fairly arbitrary goals, you know, like the 8 glasses of water a day. It's actually just a figure that got plucked out of thin air. And it's the same with the 10,000 steps. It's a healthy-ish, you know, it reflects a decent amount of exercise, but it's meaningless essentially. And yet people, you know, who doesn't go, but I need to hit my 10,000 steps.
Okay, but this particular development with Dexcom on glucose tracking, for people with diabetes, that would be a game changer if it worked, wouldn't it? It's not a gratuitous piece of information. That's important. Yeah,
I mean, this is an important thing. They've estimated 415 million people worldwide with diabetes, and this would mean they don't have to do the daily finger pricks. So it would have a huge effect. So I think this is one of the more positive aspects of what you can do with this technology.
How would it work, by the way? I mean, Idiot's Guide.
No, apparently I'm a little bit hazy about the science here, but apparently it kind of sounds a bit gruesome, but it inserts a tiny sensor under your skin, which sounds grim, but I suppose it's better than having to do it daily.
So, but the gadget itself, I find it hard to imagine Apple selling a thing that you have to implant in your skin. So do you go to the doctor first?
Their device would be the wearable device, and then it's automatically synced to the Apple Watch. The Apple Watch itself isn't going to come with like a tiny needle on the underside of the
every
face.
time you put it on.
So it's almost a bit like when you get your cat microchipped or whatever, isn't it? Like you can then get technologies at home that will interact with their microchip, but the vet has to put the chip in.
Yeah.
I don't know that people would enjoy being compared to cats. But to be fair, I guess the companies will always know where they are, so it's not that dissimilar.
I find it really disturbing, though. I mean, I think that this could certainly help a lot of people if it works. But what if it doesn't work? What if it starts sending false data? What if it starts being completely unreliable? Then what? What if you have, an attack or your sugar drops or spikes because you've been over-relying on this wearable device?
And these devices aren't foolproof. There was a separate report this week with scientists warning that many sleep apps and devices provide inaccurate data, and people are getting obsessive. I do it. My Fitbit stopped tracking. I'm obsessed with sleep, but my Fitbit stopped tracking my sleep for 2 days last week. And I was confused. I'm like, I don't know if I'm tired. I can't tell. It's not telling me.
This is the scary thing, is that it's, people are losing their trust, we see on a massive scale, in institutions. And, medicine is one of those institutions, like we've seen the anti-vaccination movement and stuff. And these trackers are one of the ways that companies are saying, oh, look, we know you don't trust all the traditional institutions. We're putting power into your hands. Look, you can see all this raw data and you can make your own informed decision about what to do about your health. But really, we aren't informed enough. And they certainly, can't be trusted to take the place of doctors and hospitals, and neither can we.
Well, you say that, although actually, if I had diabetes and my doctor said to me, you can choose which wearable device you have to monitor your glucose levels. You can have the one that's subsidised by the NHS, which inevitably would be the kind of wristband version of NHS spectacles, right? Clunkly and blue, and you have to take it back and someone else has worn it. Or you can have the one made by Apple that's going to cost you $500, but it's made by Apple. I do trust the Apple one more, don't you? Isn't that what these companies have done? We actually do trust them with our data more than other institutions.
You're part of the problem, Olly.
Well, on that bombshell, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie and to Kari Wilkins and Jess Hullinger. Sound smarter and more informed than all of your friends by hitting that subscribe button on The Week Unwrapped podcast. Just search for us on your app of choice and get 3 new stories every week. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Jesse James and Emma Corsham at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.